be identified with an account so that you can control their access to your organization's applications, data, and services. The processes that support this requirement are referred to as Identity and Access Management, IAM. Within IAM, authentication technologies ensure that only valid subjects, users, or devices can operate an account. Authentication requires the account holder to submit credentials that should only be known or held by them in order to access the account. There are many authentication technologies, and it is imperative that you be able to implement and maintain these security controls. As well as ensuring that only valid users and devices connect to managed networks and devices, you must ensure that these subjects are authorized with only the necessary permissions and privileges to access and change resources. These tasks are complicated by the need to manage identities across on-premises networks, cloud services, and web/mobile apps. Lesson objectives. In this lesson, you will do the following. Implement password-based and multi-factor authentication. Implement account policies and authorization solutions. Implement single sign-on and federated identity solutions.
When it comes to implementing IAM, certain authentication methods, I think 2FA is the biggie that people like to talk about. So let's talk about, what 2FA is all about. Okay, so there's multi-factor authentication, which means you're asked to provide more than one factor. Usually we're used to providing passwords, and we know where that takes us, the chaos that has bred for years now, decades. But the idea of multi-factor means that you can use, 2 or 3 or what have you. But usually people implement 2FA, that's two-factor authentication, and usually that involves what some sort of password, that's the first one. And the second one is usually some sort of token. And that token can be a physical token such as your ATM card or something like that, or it can be a software-generated token that is usually found on somebody's phone. In this case, I've got myself the Authy application here. And with Authy, that turns my phone into something of a token generator, or at least a token receiver. Let's go back to my Linux system here that I'm configuring. And what I'm doing is I'm configuring Secure Shell to do a couple of things here. Already it is using public key authentication. That's been around for decades, and it works really well. But one of the things that I am telling my Secure Shell server to do as I go through this configuration file, this challenge response authentication feature is usually it says no, but I've got it to say yes. Okay, and the second thing what that does is that tells Secure Shell not only you're going to use a password, I'm going to have you use some sort of other second factor. And then what I'm doing, I'm going to go here is I'm going to take a look at this configuration file, and I'm going to tell it a couple of things. The first thing is I'm going to tell it to go down here and to use this right here, to use the Google Authenticator. Notice where it says PAM_Google Authenticator. Google Authenticator is a service that's been around for a long time. And it's a very useful one. And using Google Authenticator, what I can do is set up the idea of using a second factor. In this case, using that Authy application. And so using Google Authenticator, and I can make this time-based, I can set up this particular server using this quick response code and this information and set up multi-factor authentication. Now, I've already done that. So let me show you an example coming in from another system, from my Ubuntu system. I'm basically going to start a Secure Shell session right here. And I'm just doing a standard Secure Shell session. Normally, it would just log in because I have set up my public key authentication. But in this case, it's saying, well, you're partially authenticated, Stanger, but you're not all the way there. Now, the reason why I'm not all the way there, because it's asking for this verification code. It's like, well, what do you mean verification code? Well, remember I was, going on about this Authy application here. So all I have to do is go in here and go into Authy, and I've gotten my second code that I have to enter into this server. Let's see if I got the right one. I usually don't. So let's give it a shot here. In this case, it's 563.869, and let's see if that worked. My goodness, it worked. See where it says, welcome to Ubuntu 18.04. I am now remotely administering that system using Secure Shell, and I did it by using multi-factor authentication, not just public key authentication, which has been around a while, but using a second factor. So this is what it means to do multi-factor authentication and get it configured in an internet-aware system.
Exam objectives covered. 4.6 given a scenario, implement and maintain identity and access management. Assuming that an account has been created securely and the identity of the account holder has been verified, authentication verifies that only the account holder is able to use the account and that the system may only be used by account holders. Authentication technologies allow the use not only of passwords, but also of biometric and token factors to better secure accounts. Understanding the strengths and weaknesses of these factors will help you to implement and maintain strong authentication systems. Authentication design. Authentication is performed when a supplicant or claimant presents credentials to an authentication server. The server compares what was presented to the copy of the credentials it has stored. If they match, the account is authenticated. Authentication design refers to selecting a technology that meets requirements for confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Confidentiality, in terms of authentication, is critical because if account credentials are leaked, threat actors can impersonate the account holder and act on the system with whatever rights they have. Integrity means that the authentication mechanism is reliable and not easy for threat actors to bypass or trick with counterfeit credentials. Availability means that the time taken to authenticate does not impede workflows and is easy enough for users to operate. There are many different technologies for defining credentials. These can be categorized as factors. The longest-standing authentication factor is something you know, or a knowledge factor. The typical knowledge factor is the login, composed of a username and a password. The username is typically not a secret, although it should not be published openly. But the password must be known only to the account holder. A passphrase is a longer password composed of several words. This has the advantages of being more secure and easier to remember. Windows sign-in screen. Screenshot used with permission from Microsoft. A personal identification number, PIN, is also something you know. Originally, PINs were associated with short for or 6-digit numeric sequences used with bank cards. In modern authentication designs, the main characteristic of a PIN is that it is valid for authenticating to a single device only. This type of PIN can use any characters and length. Password concepts. Improper credential management continues to be one of the most fruitful vectors for network attacks. If an organization must continue to rely on password-based credentials, its usage needs to be governed by strong policies and training. A password best practices policy instructs users on choosing and maintaining passwords. More generally, a credential management policy should instruct users on how to keep their authentication method secure, whether this be a password, smart card, or biometric ID. The credential management policy also needs to alert users to diverse types of social engineering attacks. Users need to be able to spot phishing and farming attempts so that they do not enter credentials into an unsecure form or spoofed site. To supplement best practice awareness, system-enforced account policies can help to enforce credential management principles by stipulating requirements for user-selected passwords. Password length enforces a minimum length for passwords. There may also be a maximum length. Password complexity enforces password complexity rules, such as no use of a username within the password and a combination of at least 8 uppercase / lowercase alphanumeric and non-alphanumeric characters. Password age forces the user to select a new password after a set number of days. Password reuse and history prevents the selection of a password that has been used already. The history attribute sets how many previous passwords are blocked. The minimum age attribute prevents a user from quickly cycling through password changes to revert to a preferred phrase. Password aging and expiration can mean the same thing. However, some systems distinguish between them. If this is the case, aging means that the user can still log on with the old password after the defined period, but they must then immediately choose a new password. Expiration means that the user can no longer sign in with the outdated password and the account is effectively disabled. You should note that the most recent guidance issued by NIST, NVL Pubs, NIST/gov/NIST/Special Publications/NIST, SB 800-63 PDF, deprecates some of the traditional elements of password best practices, such as complexity, aging, and the use of password hints. Password reuse can also mean using a work password elsewhere, on a retail website, for instance. This sort of behavior can only be policed by soft policies. Rate your Password managers. Users often adopt poor credential management practices that are hard to control, such as using the same password for corporate networks and consumer websites. This makes enterprise network security vulnerable to data breaches from these websites. This risk is mitigated by a password manager. The user selects a password manager app or service. Most operating systems and browsers implement password managers. Examples include Windows Credential Manager and Apple's iCloud Keychain. If using a third-party password manager, the user installs a plugin for their chosen browser. The user secures the password vault with a master password. The vault is likely to be stored in the cloud so that accounts can be accessed across multiple devices, but some password managers offer local storage only. When the user creates or updates an account, the password manager generates a random password. The parameters can be adjusted to meet whatever length and complexity policy is required by the site. When the user subsequently browses a site, the password manager validates the site's identity using its digital certificate and presents an option for the user to fill in the password. Using the LastPass Password Manager browser plugin to sign in to CompTIA's website. Screenshot courtesy of CompTIA Incorporated and LastPass USLP. The main risks from password managers are selection of a weak master password, compromise of the vendor's cloud storage or systems, and impersonation attacks designed to trick the manager into filling a password to a spoof site. Multi-factor authentication. An authentication design that uses only passwords or a single knowledge factor is considered weak. Password secrets are too prone to compromise to be reliable. Other types of authentication factor can be used to supplement or replace password-based logins. A multi-factor authentication, MFA, technology combines the use of more than one type of factor. Something you have factor. Something you have is an ownership factor. It means that the account holder possesses something that no one else does, such as a smart card, key fob, or smartphone that can generate or receive a cryptographic token. Something your factor. Something your refers to a biometric or inherence factor. A biometric factor uses either physiological identifiers, such as a fingerprint or facial scan, or behavioral identifiers, such as the way someone moves, gait. The identifiers are scanned and recorded as a template. When the user authenticates, another scan is taken and compared to the template. Somewhere you are factor. Somewhere you are means the system applies a location-based factor to an authentication decision. Location-based authentication measures some statistics about where you are. This could be a geographic location measured using a device's location service, or its Internet Protocol, IP, network address. A device's IP address could be used to refer to a logical network segment, or it could be linked to a geographic location using a geolocation service. Within a premises network, The physical port location, virtual LAN, VLAN, or Wi-Fi network can also be made the basis of location-based authentication. Location-based authentication is not used as a primary authentication factor, but it may be used as a continuous authentication mechanism or as an access control feature. For example, if a user enters the correct credentials at a remote access gateway but their IP address shows them to be in a different country than expected, access controls might be applied to restrict the privileges granted or refuse access completely. Another example is when a user appears to log in from multiple geographic locations that would be physically impossible with travel time. Multi-factor authentication requires a combination of different technologies. For example, requiring a PIN along with date of birth may be stronger than entering a PIN alone, but it is not multi-factor. You might also see references to two-factor authentication, 2FA. This just means that there are precisely two factors involved, such as an ownership-based smart card or biometric identifier with something such as a password or PIN. Rate Biometric authentication. The first step in setting up biometric authentication is enrollment. A sensor module acquires the biometric sample from the target. A feature extraction module creates a template. The template is a mathematical representation of the parts of the sample that uniquely identify the target. When the user wants to access a resource, they are rescanned, and the scan is compared to the template. If they match to within a defined degree of tolerance, access is granted. Biometric authentication can be challenging to implement. The efficacy rate of biometric pattern acquisition and matching and suitability as an authentication mechanism can be evaluated using the following metrics and factors. False rejection rate, FRR, is where a legitimate user is not recognized. This is also referred to as a type 1 error or false non-match rate, FNMR. FRR is measured as a percentage. False acceptance rate, FAR, is where an interloper is accepted, type 2 error or false match rate, FMR. FAR is measured as a percentage. False rejection causes inconvenience to users, but false acceptance can lead to security breaches, and so is usually considered the most important metric. Crossover error rate, CER, the point at which FRR and FAR meet. The lower the CER, the more efficient and reliable the technology. Errors are reduced over time by tuning the system. This is typically accomplished by adjusting the sensitivity of the system until CER is reached. Throughput, speed, is the time required to create a template for each user and the time required to authenticate. This is a major consideration for high-traffic access points, such as airports or railway stations. Failure to enroll rate, FER, are incidents in which a template cannot be created and matched for a user during enrollment. Cost/implementation. Some scanner types are more expensive, whereas others are not easy to incorporate on mobile devices. Users can find it intrusive and threatening to privacy. The technology can be discriminatory or inaccessible to those with disabilities. Fingerprint recognition is the most widely implemented biometric authentication method. The technology required for scanning and recording fingerprints is relatively inexpensive, and the process quite straightforward. A fingerprint sensor is usually implemented as a small capacitive cell or optical camera that can detect the unique pattern of ridges making up the pattern. The technology is also non-intrusive and relatively simple to use, although moisture or dirt can prevent readings.
Description.
The head at the top reads, "Great." Now repeat. The text below the header reads, "Move your finger slightly to add all the different parts of your fingerprint." Below the text is a fingerprint sensor to record the fingerprint. Configuring fingerprint recognition on an Android TM smartphone. Android is a trademark of Google LLC. Facial recognition records multiple indicators about the size and shape of the face, like the distance between the eyes or the width and length of the nose. The scan usually uses optical and infrared cameras or sensors to defeat spoofing attempts that substitute a photo for a real face. Hard authentication tokens. An ownership factor means that the user possesses some type of device that only they can operate. This is referred to as an authenticator. The authenticator is able to generate or receive a token that identifies and authenticates the user. There are three main types of token generation. Certificate-based authentication is when the supplicant controls a private key that can generate a unique signed token. The identity provider can verify the signature via the public key. The main drawback of this approach is the administrative burden of implementing PKI to issue digital certificates. One-time password (OTP) is when a token is generated using some sort of hash function on a shared secret value plus a synchronization seed, such as a timestamp, TOTP, or HMAC, HOTP. The token can only be used once. A new token is generated for each authentication decision. This approach still uses a key pair and hashing for security, but it does not require PKI. Fast Identity Online, FIDO, Universal Second Factor, U2F, uses a public/private key pair to register each account, avoiding the need to communicate a shared secret, which is a weakness of HOTP and TOTP. The private key is locked to the U2F device and signs the token. The public key is registered with the authentication server and verifies the token. As no digital certificates are involved, the solution does not rely on PKI. A hard authentication token is generated within a secure crypto processor. The authentication design means that there is no transmission of the token itself. Several device-based authenticators can be used to implement hard tokens. Smart cards implement certificate-based authentication. The smart card stores the user's digital certificate, the private key associated with the certificate, and a personal identification number, PIN, used to activate the card. The card must be presented to a reader. There are physical contact and contactless near-field communication, NFC, card types. One-time password (OTP) refers to a crypto processor that can generate a token. This type of hardware token does not need an interface to connect with the computer. The user just reads the code displayed. Security key refers to a portable hardware security module, HSM, with a computer interface, such as USB or NFC. They're most closely associated with U2F, but some might also support certificate-based authentication or HOTP/TOTP. A security key must be activated to show presence. Some keys just have an activation button, but most use a biometric fingerprint reader for better security. A PIN must also be configured as a backup mechanism. Key fob token generator. Image copyright 123rf.com. There are also simpler smart cards and fobs that simply transmit a static token programmed into the device. For example, many building entry systems work on the basis of static codes. These mechanisms are highly vulnerable to cloning and replay attacks. Rate Soft authentication tokens. A soft authentication token is a one-time password generated by the identity provider and transmitted to the supplicant. The OTP could be sent to a registered phone number as an SMS/text message or sent to an email account. This method is more likely to use counter-based tokens, though they will still have an expiry period. Soft tokens sent via SMS or email do not really count as an ownership factor. These systems can be described as two-step verification rather than MFA. The tokens are highly vulnerable to interception. A more secure soft OTP token can be generated using an authenticator app. This is software installed on a computer or smartphone. The user must register each identity provider with the app, typically using a scannable quick response (QR) code to communicate the shared secret. When prompted to authenticate, the user must unlock the authenticator app with their device credential to view the OTP token. There is less risk of interception than with an SMS or email message, but as it runs on a shared-use device, there is the possibility that malware could compromise the app.
Description.
The laptop has a web browser open to the site https://www.CompTIA.org. The site's page has a verification box with the words "Verify your identity." Below is the direction "Check your phone" for a push notification. A phone number with asterisks and a push notification icon is below the instructions. Other options and need help are underlined at the bottom of the verification box. The smartphone has a settings symbol with the question, "Are you logging in with Office 365?" There is a location icon with an address, a clock icon with the time, and a person icon with an email address in a list. Below the list is an X mark in a circle labeled Deny and a check mark in a circle labeled Approve. Using an authenticator app to sign in to a site. After the user signs in with a password, the site prompts them to authorize the sign in using the authenticator app installed on their smartphone. Rate your confidence. Continue. Passwordless authentication. With token-based MFA, the user account is typically still configured with a password. This might be used as a backup mechanism, or there might be a two-step verification process where the user must enter their password and then submit an OTP. Passwordless means that the whole authentication system no longer processes knowledge-based factors. The FIDO2 with WebAuthn and specifications provides a framework for passwordless authentication. It works basically as follows. The user chooses either a roaming authenticator, such as a security key, or a platform authenticator implemented by the device OS, such as Windows Hello or Face ID/Touch ID for macOS and iOS. The user configures a secure method or local gesture to confirm presence and authenticates the device. This gesture could be a fingerprint, face recognition, or PIN. This credential is only ever validated locally by the authenticator. The user registers with a web application or service, referred to as a relying party. For each new relying party, the authenticator generates a public/private key pair. The user's client browser obtains the public key from the authenticator and registers it to associate it with an account on the relying party. When presented with an authentication challenge, the user performs the local gesture to unlock the private key. The private key is used to sign a confirmation that the local gesture worked, which is then sent to the relying party. The relying party uses the public key to verify the signature and authenticate the account session. As with FIDO U2F, this provides similar security to smart card authentication, but does not require accounts to have digital certificates and PKI, reducing the management burden. FIDO 2 WebAuthn improves on FIDO U2F by adding an application programming interface, API, that allows web applications to work without a password element to authentication. Most FIDO U2F authenticators should also support FIDO 2/WebAuthn. For a passwordless system to be secure, the authenticator must be trusted and resistant to spoofing or cloning attacks. Attestation is a mechanism for an authenticator device, such as a FIDO security key or the TPM in a PC or laptop, to prove that it is a root of trust. Each security key is manufactured with an attestation and model ID. During the registration step, if the relying party requires attestation, the authenticator uses this key to send a report. The relying party can check the attestation report to verify that the authenticator is a known brand and model and supports whatever cryptographic properties the relying party demands. Note that the attestation key is not unique. If it were unique, it would be easy to identify individuals and be a serious threat to privacy. Instead, it identifies a particular brand and model. Exam objectives covered. 4.6 given a scenario, implement and maintain identity and access management. Authorization is the part of identity and access management that governs assigning privileges to network users and services. Implementing an access control model helps an organization to manage the implications of privilege assignments and to account for the actions of both regular and privileged administrative users. Account policies help you to protect credentials and to detect and manage risks from compromised accounts. Discretionary and mandatory access control. A user account that has been authenticated can be allocated rights and permissions on networks, computers, and data. An access control model describes the principles that govern how users receive rights. Discretionary access control. Discretionary access control, DAC, is based on the primacy of the resource owner. DAC is the most flexible model and is currently implemented widely in computer and network security. In file system security, it is the model used by default for most Unix/Linux distributions and Microsoft Windows. As the most flexible model, it is also the weakest because it makes centralized administration of security policies the most difficult to enforce. It is also the easiest to compromise, as it is vulnerable to insider threats and abuse of compromised accounts. Mandatory access control. The DAC model exposes access control, MAC, is based on security clearance levels. Rather than defining ACLs on resources, each object is given a classification label and each subject is granted a clearance level. In a confidentiality-oriented multi-level system, subjects are permitted to read objects classified at their own clearance level or below. For example, a user with top secret clearance could read data with top secret, secret, and confidential classification labels. A user with secret clearance could access secret and confidential levels only. Labeling objects and granting clearance takes place using pre-established rules. As a simple classification system is inflexible, most MAC models add the concept of compartment-based access. For example, a data file might be at secret classification and located in the HR compartment. Only subjects with secret and HR clearance could access the file. In MAC, users with high clearance are not permitted to write low clearance documents. This is referred to as write up, read down. This prevents, for example, a user with top secret clearance republishing some top secret data that they can access with secret clearance. Role and attribute-based access control. Role and attribute-based access control use non-discretionary, rules-based permissions assignments with more flexibility than MAC. Role-based access control. The concept of a security group account goes some way toward turning a discretionary system into a role-based one. Role-based access control, REAC, means that an organization defines its permission requirements in terms of the tasks that an employee or service must be able to perform. Each set of permissions is a role. Each principal, user, or service account is allocated to one or more roles. Under this system, the right to modify the permissions assigned to each role is reserved to a system owner. Therefore, the system is non-discretionary as each principal cannot modify the ACL of a resource, even though they can change the resource in other ways. Principals gain rights implicitly through being assigned to a role, rather than explicitly being assigned the right directly. File system ACLs, whether on local or network storage, are where these permissions are stored and enforced. The concept of a security group account goes some way toward turning a discretionary system into
Description.
a role-based one. Rather than assigning rights directly to user accounts, the system owner assigns user accounts to security group accounts. Principals gain rights by being made a member of a security group. A principal can be a member of multiple groups and can therefore receive rights and permissions from several sources. This approach can be applied across different operating systems, including both Windows and Unix/Linux environments, to ensure a flexible and scalable permissions management system. Description. The steps are as follows. 1. Assigning permissions directly to user accounts does not scale well. 2. Instead, user accounts can be made members of different security groups. 3. The security group is given permission on the object ACL and the user account inherits the permissions from the group. This ensures that permissions are consistently enforced at the file system level, regardless of the underlying operating system. Using security groups to assign privileges. Images copyright 1, 2, 3. REAC can be partially implemented by mapping security groups onto roles, but they are not identical schemes. Membership in security groups is largely discretionary, assigned by administrators rather than determined by the system. Also, ideally, a principal should only inherit the permissions of a role to complete a particular task rather than retain them permanently. Administrators should be prevented from escalating their own privileges by assigning roles to their own accounts arbitrarily or boosting a role's permissions. Attribute-based access control. Attribute-based access control, ABAC, is the most fine-grained type of access control model. As the name suggests, an ABAC system makes access decisions based on a combination of subject and object attributes plus any context-sensitive or system-wide attributes, as well as group/role memberships. These attributes could include information about the OS currently being used, the IP address, or the presence of up-to-date patches and anti-malware. For example, an attribute-based system can account for the different authentication and group membership limitations found in networked storage solutions such as NFS in Unix/Linux environments. An attribute-based system monitors the number of events or alerts associated with a user account or with a resource, or tracks access requests to ensure they are consistent in terms of timing or geographic location. It can be programmed to implement policies such as M-event control and separation of duties. M-event control is a security measure that requires a minimum number, M, of agents out of a total number, N, to work together to perform a high-level security task, such as key signing. Rule-based access control. Rule-based access control refers to any sort of access control model where access control policies are determined by system-enforced rules rather than by system users. As such, RBAC, ABAC, and MAC are all examples of rule-based or non-discretionary access control. Conditional access is an example of rule-based access control. A conditional access system monitors account or device behavior throughout a session. If certain conditions are met, it may suspend the account or may require the user to re-authenticate, perhaps using a two-step verification method. The user account control, UAC, and pseudo restrictions on privileged accounts are examples of conditional access. The user is prompted for confirmation or authentication when making requests that require elevated privileges. Role-based rights management and ABAC systems can apply a number of criteria to conditional access, including location-based policies. Least privilege permission assignments. Least privilege means that a principal is granted the minimum possible sufficient rights to complete a task that they are authorized to perform. This mitigates risk if an account should be compromised and fall under the control of a threat actor. Least privilege involves a design phase, where analysis of business workflows determines what roles and permissions are required. While least privilege is a strong design principle, implementing it successfully can be challenging. Where many users, groups, roles, and resources are involved, managing permission assignments and implications is complex and time-consuming. Improperly configured accounts can have two different impacts. On the one hand, setting privileges that are too restrictive creates a large volume of support calls and reduces productivity. On the other hand, granting too many privileges to users weakens the system's security and increases the risk of malware infection and a data breach. Ensuring least privilege also involves continual monitoring to prevent authorization creep. Authorization creep refers to a situation where a user acquires more and more rights, either directly or by being added to security groups or roles. For example, a user may be granted elevated privileges temporarily. In this case, a system is needed to ensure that the privileges are revoked at the end of the agreed period. A system of auditing should regularly review privileges, monitor group membership, review access control lists for each resource, and identify and disable unnecessary accounts.
Description.
The tabs below the name and the owner details read, permissions, share, auditing, and effective access selected. A line of text is followed by several options under the heads user/group and device. The links below read, include a user claim and include a device claim. A button below the links read, view effective access. The button is followed by a table that lists the data under the heads effective access, permission, and access limited by. The three buttons on the bottom right read OK, cancel, and apply. OK is selected and apply is inactive. Determining effective permissions for a shared folder. Screenshot used with user account provisioning. Provisioning is the process of setting up a service according to a standard procedure or best practice checklist. The IT department must keep track of all assets under management, and user accounts are a type of asset. User accounts are provisioned for new employees and for temporary access, such as by consultants and contractors. Some businesses may also need to set up customer accounts. Provisioning a user account involves the following. Identity proofing verifies that the person is who they say they are by checking official documents and records. Circumstances might also demand a background check, which verifies current and previous addresses, education, or previous employment, and whether the person has a criminal record or credit issues. Issuing credentials allows the user to select a password known only to them and/or enroll them with biometric or token-based authenticators. Issuing hardware and software assets. The user will need typically a computer and/or smartphone and possibly local copies of licensed software apps. Employees need sufficient resources to do their job. If their resources are inadequate, they might try to obtain hardware and software directly, shadow IT. Teaching policy awareness by scheduling training and providing access to learning resources so that the employee or contractor is aware of security policies and risks. They must also be aware of policies for personal use of any IT assets issued to them. Creating permissions assignment by identifying the work roles that the account must support and configuring the appropriate rights using a role-based, mandatory, or attribute-based access control model. If the account is granted privileged access, it should be tagged for close monitoring. Deprovisioning is the process of removing the access rights and permissions allocated to an employee when they leave the company or from a contractor when a project finishes. This involves removing the account from any roles or security groups. The account might be disabled for a period and then deleted or deleted immediately. Account attributes and access policies. A user account is defined by a unique security identifier, SID, a name, and a credential. Each account is associated with a profile. The profile can be defined with custom identity attributes describing the user, such as a full name, email address, contact number, department, and so on. The profile may support media, such as an account picture. As well as attributes, the profile will usually provide a location for storing user-generated data files, a home folder. The profile can also store per-account settings for software applications. Each account can be assigned permissions over files and other network resources and access policies or privileges over the use and configuration of network hosts. These permissions might be assigned directly to the account or inherited through membership in a security group or role. Access policies determine things like the right to log on to a computer locally or via a remote desktop, install software, change the network configuration, and so on. On a Windows Active Directory, network access policies can be configured via Group Policy Objects, GPOs. GPOs can be used to configure access rights for user/group/role accounts. GPOs can be linked to network administrative boundaries in Active Directory, such as sites, domains, and organizational units, OU.
Description.
The menu at the top reads File, Action, View, and Help. Below, a pane on the left shows options for 515 support domain policy, with user rights assignment selected. On the right, various policies and policy settings are listed. Allow logon through Remote Desktop Services policy, with the policy setting not defined is selected. Configuring access policies and rights using group policy objects in Windows Server 2016. Screenshot used with permission from account restrictions. Policy-based restrictions can be used to mitigate some risks of account compromise through the theft of credentials. Location-based policies. A user or device can have a logical network location identified by an IP address, subnet, virtual LAN, VLAN, or organizational unit, OU. This can be used as an account restriction mechanism. For example, a user account may be prevented from logging on locally to servers within a restricted OU. The geographical location of a user or device can be calculated using a geolocation mechanism. IP address can be associated with a map location to varying degrees of accuracy based on information published by the registrant, including name, country, region, and city. The registrant is usually the Internet Service Provider, ISP, so the information you receive will provide an approximate location of a host based on the ISP. If the ISP is one that serves a large or diverse geographical area, it is more difficult to pinpoint the location of the host Internet Service Providers, ISPs. Software libraries, such as GeoIP, facilitate querying this data. Location services are methods used by the OS to calculate the device's geographical position. A device with a global positioning system, GPS, sensor can report a highly accurate location when outdoors. Location services can also triangulate to cell towers, Wi-Fi hotspots, and Bluetooth signals where GPS is not supported. Time-based restrictions. There are 4 main types of time-based policies. A time-of-day restrictions policy establishes authorized login hours for an account. A duration-based login policy establishes the maximum amount of time an account may be logged in for. An impossible travel time/risky login policy tracks the location of login events over time. If these do not meet a threshold, the account will be disabled. For example, a user logs into an account from a device in New York City. A couple of hours later, a login attempt is made from Los Angeles, but is refused and an alert is raised because it is not feasible for the user to be in both locations. A temporary permissions policy removes an account from a security role or group after a defined period. Privileged access management. Standard users have limited privileges, typically with access to run programs and to create and modify files belonging only to their profile. A privileged account is one that can make significant configuration changes to a host, such as installing software or disabling a firewall or other security system. Privileged accounts also have the right to manage network appliances, application servers, and databases. Privileged Access Management, PAM, refers to policies, procedures, and technical controls to prevent compromise of privileged accounts. These controls identify and document privileged accounts, giving visibility into their use and managing the credentials used to access them. It is a good idea to restrict the number of administrative accounts as much as possible. The more accounts there are, the more likely it is that one of them will be compromised. On the other hand, you do not want administrators to share accounts or to use default accounts, as that compromises accountability. Users with administrative privileges must take the greatest care with credential management. Privilege access accounts must use strong passwords and ideally multi-factor authentication, MFA, or passwordless authentication. To protect privileged account credentials, it is important not to sign in on untrusted workstations. A secure administrative workstation, SAW, is a computer with a very low attack surface running the minimum possible apps. Traditional administrator accounts have standing permissions. Just-in-time, JIT, permissions means that an account's elevated privileges are not assigned at login. Instead, the permissions must be explicitly requested and are only granted for a limited period. This is referred to as Zero Standing Privileges, ZSP. There are 3 main models for implementing this. Temporary elevation means that the account gains administrative rights for a limited period. The User Account Control, UAC, feature of Windows, and the sudo command in Linux use this concept. Password vaulting/brokering means the privileged account must be checked out from a repository and is made available for a limited amount of time. The administrator must log a justification for using the privileges. Approval of the request could be automated via system-enforced policies or require manual intervention, providing a measure of M of N control. This provides better accounting oversight than temporary elevation and better protection against compromise of privileged credentials. Ephemeral credentials means the system generates or enables an account use to perform the administrative task and then destroys or disables it once the task has been performed. Temporary or ephemeral membership of security groups or roles can serve a similar purpose. As well as human administrators, PAM also applies to service accounts. Exam objectives covered. 4.6 given a scenario, implement and maintain identity and access management. While an on-premises network can use a local directory to manage accounts and rights, as organizations move services to the cloud, these authorizations have to be implemented using federated identity management solutions. Local, network, and remote authentication. One of the most important features of an operating system is the authentication provider, which is the software architecture and code that underpins the mechanism by which the user is authenticated before starting a shell. Knowledge-based authentication relies on cryptographic hashes. A plaintext password is not usually transmitted or stored in a credential database because of the risk of compromise. Instead, the password is stored as a cryptographic hash. When a user enters a password to log in, an authenticator converts what is typed into a hash and transmits that to an authority. The authority compares the submitted hash to the one in the database and authenticates the subject only if they match. Windows authentication. Windows authentication involves a complex architecture of components, docs, Microsoft.com/and-server/security/Windows-server/credentials-processes-and-Windows-authentication. But the following three scenarios are typical. Windows Local Sign-In is the Local Security Authority Subsystem Service, LSAS, that compares the submitted credential to a hash stored in the Security Accounts Manager, SAM, database, which is part of the registry. This is also referred to as interactive logon. Windows Network Sign-In is LSAS, which can pass the credentials for authentication to an Active Directory, AD, domain controller. The preferred system for network authentication is based on Kerberos, but legacy network applications might use NT-LAN Manager and TLM authentication. Remote sign-in is used if the user's device is not directly connected to the local network. Authentication can take place over a virtual private network, VPN, enterprise Wi-Fi, or web portal. These use protocols to create a secure connection between the client machine, the remote access device, and the authentication server. Linux authentication. In Linux, local user account names are stored in /etc/password. When a user logs into a local interactive shell, the password is checked against a hash stored in /etc/shadow. Interactive login over a network is typically accomplished using Secure Shell (SSH). With SSH, the user can be authenticated using cryptographic keys instead of a password. A pluggable authentication module, PAM, is a package for enabling different authentication providers, such as Smart Card Login. The PM framework can also be used to implement authentication to network directory services. Directory services. A directory service stores information about users, computers, security groups/roles, and services. Each object in the directory has a number of attributes. The directory schema describes the types of attributes, what information they contain, and whether they are required or optional. In order for products from different vendors to be interoperable, most directory services are based on the Lightweight Directory Access Protocol, LDAP, which was developed from a standard called X.500. Within an X.500-like directory, a distinguished name, DN, is a collection of attributes that define a unique identifier for any given resource. A distinguished name is made up of attribute value pairs, separated by commas. The most specific attribute is listed first, and successive attributes become progressively broader. This most specific attribute is the relative distinguished name, as it uniquely identifies the object within the context of successive, parent, attribute values.
Description.
The menu at the top reads File, Action, View, and Help. Below, a pane on the left shows options for ADSI Edit, with the option CN equals user selected. The table at the center lists the names, classes, and distinguished names. The name, CN equals Bobby, class, user, and distinguished name, CN equals Bobby, CN equals users, DC equals classroom, DC equals local is selected. A pane on the right titled Actions lists the actions, CN equals users and CN equals Bobby, each followed by a More option. Browsing objects in an Active Directory LDAP schema. Screenshot used with permission from Microsoft. Some of the attributes commonly used include common name, CN, organizational unit, OU, organization, O, country, C, and domain component, DC. For example, the distinguished name of a web server operated by Widget in the UK might be the following.
CN igual widgetweb, O igual marketing, O igual widget, C igual UK, DC igual widget, DC igual for.
Rate your confidence.
Continue. Category.
Topic 4C, Identity Management. Single sign-on authentication. A single sign-on SSO system allows the user to authenticate in one system and receive authorizations on integrated application servers without having to enter credentials again. Kerberos is a single sign-on network authentication and authorization protocol used on many networks, notably as implemented by Microsoft's Active Directory, AD service. Kerberos was named after the three-headed guard dog of Hades, Cerberus, because it consists of three parts. Clients request services from application servers, which both rely on an intermediary, a key distribution center, KDC, to vouch for their identity. There are two services that make up a KDC, the authentication service and the ticket granting service. Description. KDC, authentication service, sends the ticket granting ticket, user, pass, and timestamp to the principal, which creates a logon request directed to KDC. The application server checks that the user account is present. Kerberos Authentication Service. Images copyright 123rf.com. Kerberos can authenticate human users and application services. These are collectively referred to as principals. Using authentication to a Windows domain as an example, the first step in Kerberos SSO is to authenticate with a KDC server, implemented as a domain controller. The principal sends the authentication service, AS, a request for a ticket granting ticket, TGT. This is composed by encrypting the date and time on the local computer with the user's password hash as the key. The password hash itself is not transmitted over the network. Although we refer to passwords for simplicity, the system can use other authenticators, such as smart card login. The AS checks that the user account is present, that it can decode the request by matching the user's password hash with a 1 in the Active Directory database, and that the request has not expired. If the request is valid, the AS responds with the following data. Ticket granting ticket, TGT, contains information about the client, name and IP address, plus a timestamp and validity period. This is encrypted using the KDC's secret key. TGS session key communicates between the client and the ticket granting service, TGS. This is encrypted using a hash of the user's password. The TGT is an example of a logical token. All the TGT does is identify who you are and confirm that you have been authenticated. It does not provide you with access to any domain resources. Single sign-on authorization. Presuming the user entered the correct password, the client can decrypt the ticket granting service, TGS, session key, but not the ticket granting ticket, TGT. This establishes that the client and KDC, Kerberos Key Distribution Center, know the same shared secret and that the client cannot interfere with the TGT. To access resources within the domain, the principal requests a service ticket, a token that grants access to a target application server. This process of granting service tickets is handled by the TGS. The principal sends the TGS a copy of its TGT and the name of the application server it wishes to access plus an authenticator, consisting of a time-stamped client ID encrypted using the TGS session key. The TGS should be able to decrypt both messages using the KDC's secret key for the first and the TGS session key for the second. This confirms that the request is genuine. It also checks that the ticket has not expired and has not been used before. Replay attack. The TGS service responds with the following. A service session key is used between the client and the application server. This is encrypted with the TGS session key. A service ticket contains information about the principal, such as a timestamp, system IP address, security identifier, SID, and the SIDs of groups to which it belongs, and the service session key. This is encrypted using the application server's secret key. The principal forwards the service ticket, which it cannot decrypt, to the application server and adds another time-stamped authenticator, which is encrypted using the service session key.
Description.
The steps are as follows. 1. Principal sends service request, ticket granting ticket with user, pass, and timestamp to KDC, ticket granting service. KDC sends service ticket, user, pass, and timestamp to principal. 2. Principal presents service ticket, user, pass, and timestamp to application server. 3. Application server sends mutual authentication, optional, to principal. 4. Data transfer occurs between principal and application server. Kerberos ticket granting service. Images copyright 123rf.com. The application server decrypts the service ticket to obtain the service session key using its secret key, confirming that the principal has sent it an untampered message. It then decrypts the authenticator using the service session key. Optionally, the application server responds to the principal with the timestamp used in the authenticator, which is encrypted by using the service session key. The principal decrypts the timestamp and verifies that it matches the value already sent, and concludes that the application server is trustworthy. This means that the server is authenticated to the principal, referred to as mutual authentication. This prevents an on-path attack, where a malicious user could intercept communications between the principal and server. The server now responds to access requests, assuming they conform to the server's access control list. One of the noted drawbacks of Kerberos is that the KDC represents a single point of failure for the network. In practice, backup KDC servers can be implemented. For example, Active Directory supports multiple domain controllers, each of which are running the KDC service. Federation. Federation is the notion that a network needs to be accessible to more than just a well-defined group of employees. In business, a company might need to make parts of its network open to partners, suppliers, and customers. The company can manage its employee accounts easily enough. Managing accounts for each supplier or customer internally may be more difficult. Federation means that the company trusts accounts created and managed by a different network. As another example, in the consumer world, a user might want to use both Google Workspace and Twitter. If Google and Twitter establish a federated network for the purpose of authentication and authorization, then the user can log on to Twitter using their Google credentials, or vice versa. An on-premises network can use technologies such as LDAP and Kerberos. very often implemented as a Windows Active Directory network because the administration of accounts and devices can be centralized. When implementing federation, authentication and authorization design comes with more constraints and additional requirements to ensure interoperability between different platforms. Web applications might not support Kerberos, while third-party networks might not support direct federation with Active Directory/LDAP. The design for these cloud networks likely requires the use of other standard protocols or frameworks for interoperability between web applications. These interoperable federation protocols use claims-based identity. While the technical implementation and terminology is different, the overall model is similar to that of Kerberos SSO. The principal attempts to access a service provider, SP. The service provider redirects the principal to an identity provider, IDP, to authenticate. The principal authenticates with the identity provider and obtains a claim in the form of some sort of token or document signed by the IDP. The principal presents the claim to the service provider. The SP can validate that the IDP has signed the claim because of its trust relationship with the IDP. The service provider can now connect the authenticated principal to its own account's database to determine its permissions and other attributes. It may be able to query attributes of the user account profile held by the IDP if the principal has authorized this type of access.
Description.
The 6 steps are as follows. 1. The service provider, SP, and identity provider, IDP, have a pre-established trust relationship. 2. The user starts a session with the SP. 3. The SP redirects the user to the IDP to authenticate. 4. The user authenticates to the IDP. 5. The IDP issues a claims token to the user. 6. The user presents the claims token to the SP and is associated with a legitimate account and set of authorizations. Federated Identity Management Overview. Images copyright 123. Security Assertion Markup Language. A federated network or cloud needs specific protocols and technologies to implement user identity assertions and transmit claims between the principal, the relying party, and the identity provider. Security Assertion Markup Language, SAML, is one such solution. SAML assertions claims are written in Extensible Markup Language, XML. Communications are established using HTTP/HTTPS and the Simple Object Access Protocol, SOAP. The secure tokens are signed using the XML signature specification. The use of a digital signature allows the relying party to trust the identity provider. An example of a SCML implementation is Amazon Web Services, AWS, which functions as a SCML service provider. This allows companies using AWS to develop cloud applications to manage their customers' user identities and provide them with permissions on AWS without having to create accounts for them on AWS directly. SAMLP, Response XMLNS. SAMLP equals earn Oasis. Names, TC SAML 2.0 Protocol. XMLNS. SAML equals earn Oasis. Names, TC SAML 2.0 Assertion ID equals 200 Version equals 2.0 Issue instant equals 2020-01-01T20:00:10Z Destination equals https://sp foo/saml/acs in response to equals 100. SAML. Issuer https://it foo/sso/saml. Issuer.
Des. Signature. Des. Signature.
SAMLP status success /SAMLP status. SAML. Open authorization. Many public clouds use application programming interfaces, APIs, based on representational state transfer, REST, rather than SOAP. These are called RESTful APIs. Where SOAP is a tightly specified protocol, REST is a looser architectural framework. This allows the service provider more choice over implementation elements. Compared to SOAP and SAML, there is better support for mobile apps. Authentication and authorization for a RESTful API are often implemented using the Open Authorization (OAuth) protocol. OAuth is designed to facilitate sharing of information resources within a user profile between sites. The user creates a password-protected account at an identity provider (IDP). The user can link that identity to an OAuth consumer site without giving the password to the consumer site. A user, resource owner, can grant an OAuth client authorization to access some part of their account. A client in this context is an app or consumer site. The user account is hosted by one or more resource servers. A resource server is called an API server because it hosts the functions that allow OAuth clients, consumer sites, and mobile apps to access user attributes. An authorization server processes authorization requests. A single authorization server can manage multiple resource servers. Equally, the resource and authorization server could be the same server instance. The client app or service must be registered with the authorization server. As part of this process, the client registers a redirect URL, which is the endpoint that will process authorization tokens. Registration also provides the client with an ID and a secret. The ID can be publicly exposed, but the secret must be kept confidential between the client and the authorization server. When the client application requests authorization, the user approves the authorization server to grant the request using an appropriate method. OAuth supports several grant types or flows for use in different contexts, such as server-to-server or mobile app-to-server. Depending on the flow type, the client will end up with an access token validated by the authorization server. The client presents the access token to the resource server, which then accepts the request for the resource if the token is valid. OAuth uses the JavaScript Object Notation, JSON, Web Token, JWT, format for claims data. JWTs can be passed as base64, encoded strings in URLs and HTTP headers, and can be digitally signed for authentication and integrity. You should be able to assess the design and use of authentication products in terms of meeting confidentiality, integrity, and availability requirements. Given a product-specific setup guide, you should be able to implement protocols and technologies such as MFA, passwordless authentication, Kerberos SSO, and federated identity management. Guidelines for implementing identity and access management. Follow these guidelines when you implement authentication controls. Assess the design requirements for confidentiality, integrity, and availability given the context for the authentication solution, private network, public web, VPN gateway, or physical site premises, for instance. Determine whether multi-factor authentication, MFA, or passwordless authentication is required, and which hardware token or biometric technologies would meet the requirement. Ownership factors include smart cards, OTP keys/fobs and security keys, and OTP authenticator apps installed on a trusted device. Biometric technologies include fingerprint and face, with efficacy determined by metrics such as FAR, FRR, CER, speed, and accessibility. Two-step verification can provide an additional token to a trusted device or account via SMS, phone call, email, or push notification. Password managers can provide better security for password authentication. Establish requirements for access control between discretionary, mandatory, role-based, and attribute-based models, and whether the scope must include federated services, on-premises, and cloud, for instance. Configure accounts/roles and resources with the appropriate permissions settings using the principle of least privilege. Configure account policies to protect integrity. Credential policies to ensure the protection of standard and privileged accounts, including secure password selection. Account policies to apply conditional access based on location and time. Establish provisioning procedures to issue digital identities and account credentials securely. Establish deprovisioning procedures to remove access privileges when employees or contractors leave the company. Implement SAML or OAuth to facilitate single sign-on between on-premises networks and cloud services/applications.